This morning, Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley on the program with us. Polls show her way behind Donald Trump on Super Tuesday, but she is still raising money, adding staff across the country, and buying new ads. So what is her strategy, and what would a win look like in Texas? 3 years to the day after widespread electric outages, a Texas congressman with a bill now to connect this state to the national electric grid. What would it take, though, to get Republicans on board? And early voting starts this week. What turnout might tell us about Super Tuesday.
Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley starts now.
Good Sunday morning. I'm Jason Whiteley. Lots to get to this morning, but first let's start with the headlines here. More signs of just how deep the divide is in the Republican Party of Texas. Attorney General Ken Paxton blasted fellow Republican John Cornyn on Twitter after he and other Republicans voted to give $95 billion to Ukraine, to Israel, and Taiwan. Paxton suggested that money should be spent on the southern border, but Cornyn fired back, saying that Paxton should be more worried about his legal trial next month. The right and the far right are fighting each other over which side really is the true conservative. Texas Republicans finally decided to distance themselves from the white supremacists. Remember December? In a narrow vote, the state Republican Executive Committee refused to do that. Well, the Republican Party of Texas made headlines across the country, and on the second try last week, this new resolution passed unanimously. And Harris County is trying something new. It's giving guaranteed basic income to thousands of residents. The county will give $500 a month to low-income households. 82,000 people applied for it. 1,900 will be selected. These payouts will last for 18 months. $500 for 18 months. It's a pilot program, and Harris County is using federal dollars it got from the American Rescue Plan Act to pay for it. Nikki Haley brought her presidential campaign to Texas over the last few days, hosting meet and greets in Dallas and San Antonio and fundraisers in Houston. She is still raising money. She's still buying ads and staffing campaign offices all across the country. But polls do not give her much of a chance. So what is her strategy? We met her on the campaign trail. Ambassador, welcome to the program here.
Thank you.
Early voting starts Tuesday in this state. Polls show that Donald Trump still way ahead in Texas. What would a win look like for you here in Texas?
Well, I think our goal is we just want to continue to be competitive. That's been our whole focus along the way. We started with 2% in Iowa. We finished with 20%. We got 43% of the vote in New Hampshire. We're trying to pull it in South Carolina and keep on going. This is about the fact that we can't have a country in disarray and a world on fire and go through 4 more years of chaos. We won't survive it. 70% of Americans don't want to see a Trump-Biden rematch. 59% of Americans think Trump is too old and Biden's too old to be president. We need a new generational conservative leader to right the ship.
But polls show this is not a competitive race.
You know, I mean, I think everybody wants to say that, but if you look at 70% of Americans who say they want something different, let states vote. You know, you've only had a couple of states, so we don't name a king in America. Let people come together, let them vote. After South Carolina, Michigan's 3 days later, and then within 10 days we'll have hit 20 states. This is about giving people the options to decide what they want.
But you're still raising money, you're still producing ads, you're naming leadership teams in Minnesota and California, but polls show that you're behind in every state that's coming up. Explain where you see a path to victory, because the early states are out of the way. A lot more states are lined up here. Where do you see that path?
If you want to look at a poll and you want to talk about the poll, let's talk about the general election polls, because Donald Trump doesn't defeat Biden in any of them. He's down by 5, he's down by 7. On his best day, it's margin of error. I defeat Biden by up to 17 points. You win by that kind of margin. That's bigger than governorships. That's House, Senate, that's everything. But that's a mandate going into D.C. to stop the wasteful spending and get our economy back on track. That's a mandate to get our kids reading again and go back to the basics in education. That's a mandate to secure our borders, no more excuses. That's a mandate for law and order in our cities, and that's a mandate for a strong America where we prevent wars that we can all be proud of. That's what I'm focusing on. If Donald Trump is our nominee, we lose. There will be a female president of the United States. It will either be me or it will be Kamala Harris. This is about the fact we can't change what's happening in our country if we don't win. And Donald Trump can't win.
Let's talk about gun violence for a moment. You heard what happened in Kansas City, that parade shooting up there. It's almost a year now here in North Texas since 8 people were murdered at an outlet mall, almost 2 years now since a gunman murdered 19 fourth graders and 2 teachers in Uvalde, Texas, which I'm sure you've heard of. What do you say to a family of one of those victims, though, that hasn't seen any gun laws change since then? No reaction from lawmakers.
You know, I have a mom heart in that my daughter works at a children's hospital. I worry about her. My son-in-law is an elementary school teacher. I worry about him. My son is a senior in college. I worry about that. I wake up in the morning thinking about it. I go to bed thinking about it. But if we want to fix this, let's do the hard work. Let's go to the root cause. We have got to deal with the cancer that is mental health. We've got to focus on 1 in 3 people suffer from a mental health issue. But if treated, they can live a perfectly normal life. 80% of our mass shootings have been from someone who was going through a mental health crisis.
What about red flag laws, raising the minimum age to buy an assault-style rifle from 18 to 21? Where are you on those issues?
I think if you're able to fight in a war, you should be able to purchase a gun. But I think you should do what we did in South Carolina. What we did in South Carolina was we had any of the court cases where someone was found to be mentally unable to, they had to be committed. Right. Mentally committed. They were not able to buy a gun. But we didn't attach that to say that we were going to do this with guns. We just made sure we got the rosters of anybody who was committed that they would not be able to buy a gun. That's the first step you do. But keep in mind, you never want to go and have the rights of people to protect themselves and their families because you've got people on the streets committing illegal acts. We want to do this the right way.
Last question for you here, too. I want to ask about an abortion case in Texas that made national news. It's a woman named Kate Cox. 20 weeks, she discovered her fetus had a lethal abnormality. It's almost always fatal at birth. She had to leave Texas to get an abortion because of the state's strict laws. If the decision was in your hands, how would you decide her case?
I mean,
how would you decide these cases that are so touchy?
I hurt for her at the thought of that. I had trouble having both of my children, so I absolutely hurt for her. You know, a wrong was made right when we took it from unelected justices and put it in the hands of the people. I think that's where this issue should be. It's personal to every woman and every man, and it needs to be treated with respect. I think that Texas now needs to look at that law and say, what can we do to make sure that never happens to another woman? When you do these laws, it's more than just about being pro-life or pro-choice. It's about humanizing these issues, not demonizing these issues. I'm unapologetically pro-life, but I don't judge anyone for being pro-choice. But let's be humane about it. Let's make sure we're focusing on the fact that when an instance like this happens to a woman, we make sure that the laws are changed so that it never happens to another woman where that is the case. They need to have that relationship with their doctor so that they can make the best decisions for themselves.
Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
All right, let's bring in the roundtable to talk about the politics of all this. Bud Kennedy is here from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. I am Mitra, of course, from the Texas Tribune, and Bernadine Steptoe, a political producer at WFAA in Dallas. You just heard what she said there, Bud. What is the Haley campaign strategy from here?
She still wants to convince everybody that Donald Trump can't win and she can. And she may wind up being right about that.
You think so?
But Republicans want to see. And you know, I don't think she can get that point across by the end of these primaries. She has picked up a few points. She's only down 22 in South Carolina.
That's still a lot, though, Ian.
Yeah, I think another part of this is looking ahead at the calendar beyond South Carolina. There's some open primaries and some semi-open primaries, so there could be some crossover voters. And so she's not just looking at the Republican base, she may be looking also at, you know, people who may be crossing over from the Democratic side too, that she might be able to kind of bank on, you know, hopefully for her.
And Bernadine, you know what struck me? Covering her event in Dallas on Thursday, she had an event in San Antonio on Friday. She's still as passionate as she was, you know, last year starting this thing out, and she's still raising money. What do you take away from this?
Well, I think that she's still looking ahead, and she's not ruling herself out yet. Because as mentioned earlier, you have open primaries that she's thinking perhaps she can gain there. But as long as she's raising money, which she is, she had fundraisers here in Dallas. As long as she's raising money, why not be optimistic about doing better? And keep in mind now, remember when President Biden ran, and he ran up until the Super Tuesday, it's when he actually cinched that nomination in essence. So she has hope.
That's a good point.
Jason, you know, we've never had a situation where one candidate is trying to run a political campaign and the other one is on television every day defending himself in court. And so, I mean, he literally had a choice of trials last week where he could do press conferences. He's able to garnish all this publicity, gather all this sentiment without, and she's trying to go out and run a normal campaign. It's a tough hill to climb.
Every cycle seems unprecedented. Back to you guys in just a moment here. You know, Super Tuesday, just over 2 weeks away here in Texas. We have been checking off election dates for you here on Inside Texas Politics. 2 more dates coming up here. Early voting starts the Tuesday, the 20th, just 2 days from now. And if you vote by mail this Friday, February 23rd, the last day that you can request one of those ballots. And of course, Election Day, Super Tuesday, March 5th in Texas. It was 3 years ago that widespread electric outages left Texas in the dark. Congressman Greg Casar on his brand new bill to connect Texas to the national electric grid and why he thinks Republicans will get on board. Inside Texas Politics, back in a moment. Welcome back to Inside Texas Politics. You know, 3 years ago this morning, Texas was recovering from that humiliating disaster. Widespread electric outages during freezing temperatures that killed more than 200 people in our state. Congressman Greg Casar just filed a bill in D.C., though, requiring Texas to connect to the national grid if it is passed. He is a Democrat from Austin. Congressman Casar, welcome to the program here. The legislation that you introduced this week seems like a long time coming, almost, or actually 3 years to the date since those widespread outages across Texas. Why now, though?
Texans are sick and tired of every time there's a heat wave or a big winter storm coming for everybody to be checking to see how the grid is doing. It's time for us to make common sense changes in response to Winter Storm Uri to make it so that folks know that the lights are going to stay on. And the 2 biggest ways we can address that are 1, weatherizing and upgrading our existing grid infrastructure, and then 2, connecting the Texas grid to our east and to our west. And we know that that works because 3 years ago to the day during Winter Storm Uri, places like El Paso, which is actually interconnected to the west, and Beaumont, which is actually interconnected to the east, did not suffer those massive power outages in the same sort of way that the rest of the state that's isolated did.
Who would manage the grid, though, under this scenario? Would ERCOT still exist to manage the grid?
ERCOT would still, this would leave the state legislature still able to decide who manages the grid. And so the state legislature could keep on having ERCOT manage the grid. The difference would be that ERCOT would have to be interconnected to those other grids. That's the major change we would make. Now we know that in the past, there have been some who have argued that they want to stay disconnected, despite the fact that they know that being disconnected makes the power go out more. Even though being disconnected hurts our economy, they argue, let's stay disconnected, let's stay independent over Texas patriotism. Well, I'd rather just keep cheering for Texas football and Texas barbecue as my form of Texas patriotism and not stay disconnected. Another argument we hear from opponents is they want to stay disconnected because they don't want the big bad feds involved. Well, let me tell you what that level of federal regulation is. If you interconnect the grid, really 2 things come into play. The federal government would have more of a say in planning on how interconnection across state lines work, because we really govern in that area of interstate commerce so that it's more clear how we're interconnected. And 2, the federal government can make sure that our rules around just and reasonable rates for consumers come into play. And I know that may not be the favorite thing of big energy companies, but I think for Texas consumers, having an additional layer of protection to make sure they're not getting screwed or price gouged on their electric prices, I think that's a good thing.
Congressman, you would obviously need Republican support to get this passed. What do you think it would take to get some of your conservative colleagues on board with this?
I think that even though this is starting off as a Democratic bill, we will eventually get this passed into law as a common sense, everyday people agree on this sort of bill. It's an infrastructure bill.
But how do you do that, though? I mean, you just laid out the reasons why Republicans wouldn't support it, for patriotism and federal oversight.
Well, I didn't say that they wouldn't support it for those reasons. What I'd say is opponents, I think, that's the reasons they've leaned on in the past. That's the reasons that everybody leaned on before the winter storm. It will take some time, but you've got to start with a bill. And there had never been in the history of the United States Congress a bill to have Texas interconnect. And we finally have that bill available in front of us. It was the first time it's ever been drafted, the first time it's ever been filed. And I do think it will eventually make its way into law, because when you've got common sense, economics, the life, health, and safety of folks and the energy future of our country all aligned, I think eventually people across the aisle will come together and do the right thing.
Congressman, certainly legislation we will be watching. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.
When we come back this morning, hear that social media battle between two of the state's top Republicans. U.S. Senator John Cornyn and Attorney General Ken Paxton. Neither are up for re-election next month, so what's going on here? The roundtable is ready when we come back. Plus, Nikki Haley, she's our newest podcast episode. We put the unedited interview out there for you to hear. Everything that did not make it into this broadcast, like how the race might change if a jury convicts Donald Trump this summer. Politics available to download this morning wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Inside Texas Politics with Jason Whiteley.
All right, the roundtable is back with us this morning to put the headlines in perspective. But let's start with you. More gun violence. We saw what happened in Kansas City at the parade shooting there. Last Sunday this time, there was a shooting in Houston at Joel Osteen's church down there. Is this going to be an issue come November?
Well, it's tough to say exactly what issue it is. Nobody can get their arms around one focus on what causes shootings other than, as we heard Nikki Haley talk about, mental health. But that seems to be a common answer. You know, the Lakewood case involved somebody who, gun rights activists would say that she deserved to have a gun. She had been convicted of several misdemeanors. She had had mental treatment, but never been committed. Under the laws of Texas, she's qualified to have guns. In Kansas City, you have teenagers. Teenagers are usually using stolen guns. That's a problem of not locking cars.
And Ian, you know, we're almost 1 year out now since the tragedy would happen in the Allen Premium Outlets, almost 2 years now, come May, with what happened in Uvalde. Nothing has changed. Do voters care?
Yeah, it's you know, if you see polling, they'll still show, you know, strong concerns about gun violence, but it's not seeming to resonate in direct action. Of course, you know, after the Uvalde tragedy, Senator Cornyn led an effort that actually got some elements passed, but it was, you know, not nearly what a lot of folks wanted. But it was the first thing that had been passed related to gun violence in a generation. So it's hard to see something coming up right now, just with kind of the climate of discourse.
And Bernadine, Senator Cornyn took a lot of heat from Republicans on this issue.
Absolutely, but it doesn't appear as if any other Republicans are going to take any kind of negative talking about this issue, and it's not going to change. We're in the middle of election, and it's just not going to come up because it's not popular within the Republican Party, and then the Democratic Party apparently don't have the votes or the power to get anything done.
It's kind of hands off for everybody, Bud. But
Yeah.
God forbid, if something else were to happen later this year, that would thrust this back into the spotlight.
If there's some direction you can point and say, okay, here's something that needs to be fixed. You know, Congress has shown with Cornyn's efforts that they will step up and fix something if they can get everybody on the same page.
Go ahead, Bernadine.
That's the issue. They're not going to get everybody on the same page. And as Ian mentioned, no direct action. They might do a lot of talking, but as far as doing anything about it, I just don't see it happening during this election cycle.
Ian, let me ask you about that very public spat between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton on X, on Twitter the other day. I mean, these guys are going at it. I even texted the staff at Cornyn's office, said, I want to make sure this is a real tweet. They said, yes, this is a real tweet, going back and forth. Neither of these guys are on the ballot. What is this really about?
Well, look, you have you know, an attorney general who just kind of came off you know, being acquitted in a political trial in the Senate of impeachment accusations, and you know, very much wanting to attach himself clearly with former President Trump, and calling out this legislation that Cornyn supported, you know, that Trump has been very critical of. And you know, Cornyn is you know, is not just going to stand pat. And it was an interesting response. You know, that was very, you know, a moment of very clear, like, kind of discourse that was actually, like, very, you know, surprising to see.
Yes, surprising to say the least. And Bud, you know, you point out how Paxton called John Cornyn, the former attorney general, longtime Republican, huge conservative. He called him America's last rhino here. This really seems to be the battle for which side is more of the true conservative.
Well, you know, America's last rhino is something you commonly hear these days, but you need to look at those two tweets. John Cornyn's was so skillfully worded. He said two things nobody else is saying about Ken Paxton on the Republican side. He said that he's pushing Russian propaganda. You don't hear other prominent Republicans saying that. And this is very important. He said, you shouldn't be doing this when you're going to be facing further criminal charges. Nobody has raised the specter of further criminal charges publicly. John Cornyn did.
Neither of these guys are running for anything, but there still is an election this year. This could influence the vote in some way, I presume, couldn't it?
Well, yeah. I think that that there already is a drop-off of people supporting Ken Paxton's candidates. You see that they're not supporting his the people he's endorsing as much as Abbott or even Cornyn.
Bernadine?
And Cornyn was critical of him during the impeachment. You know, he's never actually backed Paxton, but also this takes on a risk of suppressing vote. Because if you have one side who's supporting Cornyn, and then you have another side who are definitely who's supporting Paxton, it just takes the risk of suppressing some of that vote. And they need the vote in the primary. Every candidate needs their supporters to get out and vote.
I don't know if you could suppress the vote in this primary anymore. There's just not very much of it statewide. But this is important too, because this is a former attorney general criticizing the current sitting attorney general using legal language. And so it's a really significant turning point in Texas politics.
Yeah, indeed, using legal language, which is so fascinating about this. Guys, thanks so much, Bud. I am Bernadine. We appreciate it as always. And thank you for watching as well. We're back next Sunday to take you inside Texas politics. Hope you can join us then. Take care.